You are listening to Mangoes and Malice, a full culinary cozy mystery audiobook by Celia Kinsey, writing as Abby Bine. This is part 4 of 4 parts.
Mangoes and Malice, a Wailuku Town Cozy Mystery by Celia Kinsey, writing as Abby Bine. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Chapter 28. There was a long silence on the other end of the line after I told Steve that the charred jewelry box that someone, my money was on Matt, had planted underneath Nate and Harmony's front steps had inexplicably disappeared. "I don't understand," Steve finally said. "That made 2 of us. Maybe something Samantha can tell us tomorrow will shed light on the situation," I suggested. "Maybe." I went to bed confused, and I got up confused. All day at Island Ice Cream, I couldn't stop turning over everything about the case I believed to be true and questioning every little bit of it. When Steve showed up at 4 instead of 6 as we'd arranged, he was grinning ear to ear. "Close up early," was the first thing he told me. "Our kids are coming home." "What?" "Our kids are coming home," he repeated. "Why? What happened?" Earlier today, a search warrant was served on Tammy Danson and her husband. Based on the evidence recovered at their house, the Dansons were arrested shortly after noon. "No." "Yes. Samantha said she expects charges to be filed against the Dansons by the county prosecutor sometime tomorrow. Nate and Harmony will likely be released soon afterward." That was terrific news, but I couldn't quite believe it. "Why do I need to close up early?" I asked. "To celebrate." "Celebrating seems a little premature," I told Steve. I didn't like to burst his bubble, but nothing about the Dansons' arrest sat right with me. It wasn't that I didn't believe in Nate and Harmony's innocence. It was just that I was far from convinced of the Dansons' guilt. I couldn't help wondering if one of the pieces of evidence that had been recovered at the Dansons wasn't the charred jewelry box that had, up until recently, been nestled under Nate and Harmony's front step. I had a sneaking suspicion that the ruby ring, which had been missing from the collection, was now back in its place. "I can't help feeling we're all being played," I said. "We? You, me, the police, the county prosecutor, and most of all, the Dansons." But I had no proof to back up my theories. I should have felt overjoyed that Nate and Harmony were likely off the hook for shooting Frank Vatu, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was going to be an equally grave miscarriage of justice if the Dansons got convicted of holding up Frank's filling station and trying to murder the man. "I thought you'd be happy," said Steve. "I am happy," I said, "but I'd still like to meet with Samantha if she's willing. I don't know what I expected Ms. Samantha Pine to look like, but I was not expecting a pleasant-looking woman with long gray hair who had to be at least 2 decades my senior. She was wearing a huge diamond wedding set on her left ring finger. When she rejected my proffered hand and gave me a hug instead, I felt a little foolish for feeling jealous of her and Steve's relationship, whatever it was. "This is Samantha," Steve said. "She's the kid's lawyer, but I may have forgotten to mention that she's also married to my cousin." He had forgotten to mention that. "You don't look as happy as I expected you to be," Samantha said as we sat down to order. We'd met at a place that specialized in seafood, and I'd never even tasted half the things on the menu. I'd settled on something called an Ono burger when Samantha commented on my demeanor. "I guess I'm just not ready to believe it's real," I said. It didn't seem like the time or place to bring up my misgivings that the police might have arrested the wrong pair once again. "Cynthia was hoping that you might be willing to share what you know about the case with us," said Steve. "It doesn't matter much now," said Samantha. "But since I'd already made copies of everything I had, I went ahead and brought it all along." She slid a fat manila envelope across the table to me as if it were an afterthought. Now that I'd likely have Nate and Harmony's own eyewitness account sometime tomorrow, whatever the envelope contained seemed less valuable. But I had no intention of not going through whatever Samantha had collected with a fine-tooth comb. "What are you going to do, Cynthia?" Samantha asked. "Once Nate and Harmony are released?" I hadn't thought that far. I'd left all my things, which didn't amount to much since I'd downsized, in a storage unit in Austin. I didn't have a house to go back to. When Nate and Harmony came home, they'd bring Arlo and Indigo back from Saffron's place. I didn't know how they managed to fit the four of them into that tiny one-bedroom bungalow. Never mind. One more. I could not stay with Nate and Harmony. It was out of the question. My anxiety must have shown on my face because Steve said, "Don't worry. We'll find you someplace to stay." As soon as I got home that evening, I spread out the documents contained in the envelope that Samantha had given me. There was a copy of the police report, which included statements from Nate and Harmony. Nate and Harmony's statements had obviously been disregarded as falsified by the arresting officers, but I took them to be truthful. According to the report, both Nate and Harmony had briefly seen the robbers, wearing a Dolly Parton and a Richard Nixon mask, enter the premises. They had hastily hidden behind a counter which contained the soda machine. They had heard a female voice demand that Frank empty the safe and offer him a pillowcase to contain the money. There had been a period of silence during which Nate and Harmony had waited. Then they'd heard the bell over the door tinkle. This made no sense to me. I'd yet to come to a report of shots being fired. Had one of the robbers departed but not the other? Had a third person entered the store? Chapter 29. I continued reading the police report. According to Nate and Harmony's account, they were just about to emerge from their hiding place behind the counter when a series of 3 shots rang out. Then someone groaned, they assumed it was Frank, followed by a thud as Frank fell to the floor. There was another period of silence during which Nate peeked around the counter and saw Frank prostrate and bleeding on the floor with his phone lying next to him. Nate and Harmony conferred quietly and decided that Frank's attackers must have either managed to exit the front without activating the bell or had fled out the back. Nate and Harmony crept from their hiding place, used Frank's phone to call 911 since neither of them had a working phone on their persons, and tried to stanch Frank's bleeding with an old towel when Harmony looked up and saw through the front glass window that the robber impersonating Dolly Parton was returning to the store. This made no sense to me until I continued on with the report and found that Harmony had noted that the pillowcase full of money had remained on the front counter, so the supposition was that Dolly had returned for the forgotten cash. At this point, Nate and Harmony had opted to flee out the back door of the convenience store into the alley behind the filling station. They'd hidden behind the dumpster until they were ordered out of their place of concealment by the officer who was searching the premises. I believed every word of Nate and Harmony's report to the police, but clearly the police themselves had not because they'd ended up arresting Nate and Harmony instead of whoever had been wearing those absurd masks. Several things about the report bothered me, and I wanted to keep looking through the materials from the envelope, but I was too tired. If there was one thing that reading that police report had convinced me of, it was the necessity of going back to the spot where Pat, Frank's neighbor, had found the abandoned likenesses of Richard Nixon and Dolly Parton. The spot where she'd found the masks might give me valuable clues as to where the robbers had gone after they'd disposed of the evidence. If I could just get my hands on footage that put the pair in the right place at the right time, I might forestall another grave miscarriage of justice. I'd get up early in the morning before I opened Island Ice Cream and stop by to see Pat on the way to work. I'd taken Pat's number on my first visit, so after I fed Lix her evening formula, I texted Pat and asked if she'd take me to see the exact spot where she'd found the masks. She answered back right away and said she'd be expecting me at 8. I tossed and turned all night. Several times I was convinced I heard footsteps on the front porch, but since Rix, who lay on a bed in the kitchen within sight of the front door, didn't stir, and when I crept out myself to peek through the tiny window, I could see there was no one there. I chalked it up to paranoia. I ought to have been more at peace than I'd been in months. Why was I such a bundle of nerves? The next morning, I was standing on Pat's doorstep promptly at 8. It was a rerun of my last visit, with the comically hostile exchange between Pat and Adonis, her giant parrot, filtering through the door while I waited to be admitted. This time, however, Pat did not invite me in. Instead, we set off immediately for the spot she'd found the masks. I remember exactly where it was, she told me. She walked so fast that I had a hard time keeping up. I thought at the time that it was a weird place to abandon them. I was tempted to ask where Pat considered a normal place to abandon a pair of celebrity look-alike masks, but I didn't get a chance because we'd already arrived at the spot, and I couldn't believe my good fortune. When Pat had first told me about finding the masks in the alley, she'd described the location as being behind her house. That was sort of true. We were still within sight of Pat's back door, and we were in the alley, but we were also behind a liquor store. I can't believe it, I said, pointing at the back door of the liquor store. What can't you believe? Pat asked. Look. Pat still failed to detect the reason for my excitement. There's a camera up there, I said. I just hope they kept the footage from the day of the robbery. I'm sure it's very common for liquor stores to have security cameras installed. After all, they are notorious for being targeted by all sorts of miscreants, and this store must have been extraordinarily unlucky in the past, because there was not one camera but two which captured the view into the alley. The alley ran roughly north and south, and one camera was angled to see anyone approaching from the north, and another was angled to take in the view to the south. I just hope they've saved the footage and will let me look at it, I said. I think I might be able to help you, Pat told me. Oh? That store belongs to my ex-brother-in-law. It seemed that Pat and her ex-husband had parted on good terms, either that or his family had taken her side. Because 10 minutes later, I was sitting in the cramped back office of the liquor store while watching as Pat's ex-brother-in-law, Lockie, scrolled through files trying to locate the ones from the day of the robbery. In the end, I opted to head to work. Lockie promised to keep looking, and when he found anything of interest, he'd inform me right away. I trusted him. I didn't have any reason not to. When I arrived at Island Ice Cream, I placed Licks into the little wire pen under the palm tree. Steve had constructed the pen a few days ago. Licks was stronger now and sleeping less. And since she was constantly escaping her box and getting underfoot, it was time to figure out another way of keeping her safe and contained. When I had a spare minute during the morning hours, I called Steve and filled him in on all the latest developments. Pat's ex-brother-in-law, Lockie, promised me he'd let me know as soon as he found anything interesting. Do you think we can trust him? Steve asked. Why wouldn't we be able to trust him? Everybody knows everybody around here. That did seem to be the case. Lockie didn't mention knowing the Dansons or Frank and Laura, I pointed out. What about Matt? Steve had a point. The only things I knew about Matt were that Zoe had probably seen him getting ready to plant the charred jewelry box under Nate and Harmony's steps. Martin thought he was having an affair with Tammy Danson, and he rode a motorcycle. You're right, I said. We don't even know Matt's last name, even though he seems to know just about everything about me, right down to my middle name. I suspect he knows just about as much about you. Where did you say Matt works? Steve asked. I hadn't said, and it took me a minute to remember what Martin had told me. Some place called Wally's Tires, I think. I think it's time I got new tires for my Jeep, said Steve. If you go in there to get new tires and start asking questions, Matt'll know right away what you're doing. You're right, said Steve. Maybe I can get Saffron to do it for me. If Matt knows who you and I are, don't you think he'll have also checked into every member of Nate and Harmony's families? I suppose, said Steve. We'll have to get someone else to help us. What about Linda? I asked. Linda? Auntie Alma's daughter. I doubt Matt will have paid any attention to her. Chapter 30. By mid-afternoon, it had all been arranged. Luckily, Linda was a regular patron of Wally's, and her tires were due to be rotated. "Find out everything you can about Matt," I instructed her, "even if you have to look a little silly doing it." "Everything?" "Well, start with finding out his last name and move on from there." "What exactly is it you suspect him of?" she asked, "besides possibly planting evidence?" "I'm not sure exactly how he's involved, but he's the piece of the puzzle that doesn't seem to fit in anywhere, so I can't help wondering if he might not be the key to solving the case." "Have you heard yet when Nate and Harmony are getting released?" "No, but Samantha thinks it could be as early as this afternoon." The afternoon passed slowly. There were plenty of customers, but in between each cone I packed, I kept checking my phone for the word that the kids had been released. Unfortunately, other than a series of spam texts offering me a deal of a lifetime on car insurance, which was ironic considering I owned no such vehicle, my phone was silent. Around 3, Linda stopped by to report on her excursion to Wally's Tires. When she arrived, there were 3 cars worth of tourists in line. "I have big news," said Linda before she withdrew to the shade to wait until my last customer selected and finished consuming their dairy treats. It was just as the last car of tourists was pulling out of the gravel lot that my phone finally dinged. It was a text from Steve. "I'm on my way to get the kids. Want to come?" "Yes." "How soon?" "As soon as I can get there." "Nate and Harmony just got released," I told Linda. "Steve's coming to get me, and we're going together to pick them up." After Linda had hugged me and I'd turned the clamshell signboard next to the trailer around to tell would-be dessert seekers that Island Ice Cream was closed for business, she said, "I'll make it quick, and you can ask questions later, but you probably ought to know that Lara and Matt are romantically involved." "Martin thought Matt was having an affair with Tammy." "I think that's unlikely." "Then what was he doing in and out of their house all the time?" "That I don't know," said Linda. "But either the man Martin saw coming and going from the Dansons wasn't Matt at all, or Matt had some other reason for being there then because he was being unfaithful to his wife." "Wife?" "It appears that Matt and Lara are married." "Married?" "They have 2 children together." "What? Are you sure he wasn't pulling your leg?" "I saw the kids in question, and it wasn't him I talked to, actually." "I didn't even see the man," said Linda. "It was Lara I chatted with." "What? How?" "She was sitting in the waiting area. She told me herself that she was waiting for her husband, Matt, and they were going to lunch together." "And she had the kids in tow?" "Yes," said Linda. "They're cute little things, too. One is still an infant, and the other is about 2, I'd say." "I don't know what to think," I said as I saw Steve's Jeep pulling into the parking lot. "There was one other thing Lara told me about Matt," Linda said, "and it might explain what he could have been doing going in and out of the Dansons' house on a regular basis." I would have asked Linda more questions about the chat she'd had with Lara in the lobby of the tire shop, but Steve arrived to pick me up while we were still talking. This revelation that Lara and Matt were husband and wife was both startling and something I should have discovered earlier. True, things were working out on their own. Nate and Harmony were standing outside the entrance of the Maui County Correctional Center at that very moment, waiting on Steve and me to come and get them. Even though I couldn't have been happier that our kids were coming home, something didn't sit right with me. I was pretty sure the Dansons weren't the guilty party, but the question of just who had shot Frank Vatu and why was still an open question. Steve and I rode in silence all the way to the jail. I think, what next, was the question on both of our minds. Nate and Harmony had been abruptly lifted out of their ordinary existence, and now they were going to be abruptly dumped back into it. "Have you told Arlo and Indigo?" I asked Steve as we pulled into the parking lot at the correctional facility. "I told Saffron." She thought it might be best just to bring Harmony and Nate over to her place, just in case. Just in case something should go wrong, it would be cruel to crush the hopes of the little ones. It seemed too good to be true right up until the second I saw Nate and Harmony standing outside the front doors of the jail, wearing rumpled clothes they'd probably been arrested in, and clutching the black plastic trash bag that contained the few personal belongings they'd had on their persons when they'd been taken into custody. They were both smiling, but as soon as Steve and I approached them, all four of us dissolved into tears. We didn't loiter at the front of the jail. After a quick, teary hug, we rushed to Steve's Jeep. I don't think any of the four of us wanted to linger any longer than absolutely necessary. Nate and Harmony sat in the back, and we headed off to Saffron's to surprise little Indigo and Arlo. Saffron didn't have a car big enough to accommodate her temporarily expanded family, so she'd borrowed Nate and Harmony's minivan when she'd taken in 2 extra kids. "We'll just stay a minute," said Steve, "and you all can drive home together." He meant Nate, Harmony, and the little ones. Steve and I had discussed it earlier, and we'd both decided that it might be best for everyone if we left the 4 of them on their own for the evening. I'd go to a hotel. My bag was packed and in the back of Steve's Jeep. "What about you, Mom?" Nate asked. "I'm staying with a friend," I lied. "What about tomorrow?" "Don't worry about tomorrow," said Steve. "We'll work out something. We'll meet you for lunch and talk about what comes next." "And don't even think about going to work tomorrow," I said. "I've got everything at Island Ice Cream firmly under control." That wasn't entirely true, but I figured the revelation that someone had pried open the door and stolen the cash box could wait. "Did they put Ted and Tammy Danson in with you guys?" I couldn't help asking. Nate said that Ted had been put in a different unit, but since all the female prisoners were housed in the same dorm-style room, Harmony said she had seen Tammy. "Maybe Ted Danson is guilty," said Harmony, "but I really don't think they've got the right woman." When Harmony said that she didn't believe that Tammy Danson had anything to do with shooting Frank Vatu, I asked why she was so convinced of the fact. Frank's niece Lara made it sound like Tammy Danson was dead set on making sure her daughter got custody of Frank's children, I told Harmony. Lara made it sound as if Tammy wouldn't stop at anything to make that happen. "Not according to Tammy," said Harmony. "She couldn't talk about anything except how worried she was about her grandchildren." "Why?" "Tammy seemed pretty broken up that Frank was still in the hospital, and now that she and Ted were locked up, there would be no one to look after her grandkids." "What about the children's mother?" "Tammy's daughter?" Harmony asked. "Yes. Tammy didn't seem to think much of her daughter's mothering instinct. She said herself that whenever the kids weren't at Frank's, she and Ted were taking care of them." That had been Martin's assessment of the situation, but since he'd most likely led me astray on the supposed affair between Tammy Danson and Matt, I was inclined to take his judgment of any situation involving the Dansons with a grain of salt. We had arrived at Saffron's house, and I knew Harmony was probably dying to see her own 2 little ones, but I couldn't resist asking one last question. "Tammy Danson was that eager to talk? If she and her husband really had nothing to do with the robbery, wouldn't she think you and Nate might actually be the guilty party?" "I don't think so," said Harmony with her hand resting on the door handle. "She seemed to believe it was an inside job." "Inside job?" was all I'd gotten out of my mouth when the front door of the house flew open and Arlo and Indigo tumbled down the front steps like a couple of excited puppies. "What should I do about licks?" I asked Steve as we stood back and watched Nate and Harmony listen to 2 simultaneous monologues about what had happened during the weeks they'd spent with Saffron. "My landlord doesn't allow pets," said Steve, "but I could probably get away with keeping her for 1 night." "I think we'd better do that, or maybe I can smuggle her into my hotel room. I hate to spring a kitten on Nate and Harmony when they've just gotten home." Licks was currently sleeping in her box, which I'd kept concealed underfoot in the front passenger seat during our trip to and from the correctional facility. "What am I going to do about a place to live?" I said. Maybe I should just go back to Austin and get out of everybody's hair." "You can't do that," Steve said. "Why not? Do you have a place to go back to?" "Not really," I admitted. "All my stuff is in storage." "Do you have someone to go back to?" "I have friends, but no one—" "I'll think about staying," I said. "At least for a little while longer, but I'll have to find a house. Or an apartment. That allowed cats. In my present state, I might have to settle for a tent amongst the shrubbery and trees that line the beach with the other homeless folks." "I might have a solution to your housing problem," said Steve, "but I'm still working on it." "Oh? Hopefully I'll close the deal soon." "Deal?" Steve was being very cryptic. "I'll let you know as soon as it's certain," he said. "What are you doing the day after tomorrow?" I asked. "I don't have any plans." "Well, I expect the kids will be ready to take over Island Ice Cream by then, and I think that it's high time that we pay Frank Vatu a visit." Chapter 31. The following morning, I went to Island Ice Cream bright and early to open up and was surprised to find Nate already there. "I thought I'd let Harmony stay at home with the kids for at least one day," he said. "I thought I'd made it clear that both of you should stay at home." Nate just went on with putting up the awning and didn't even acknowledge my suggestion that he should have stayed at home. "Thanks, Mom," he finally said. "You're welcome." "I mean it. I don't know what we would have done without you," he said as he dropped the awning and came over to pull me into a long, warm hug. He used to be a tiny little person, but now I was the small one. Nate's not much of a hugger, never has been, but on this occasion he didn't let go of me for a long time. "I'm just glad it's all over," I said. Except it wasn't over, not really, and the text I got 10 minutes later drove that point home. It was from Lockie, Pat's ex-brother-in-law, who owned the liquor store behind which the robbers had abandoned the masks. "I found the footage. I'll be right over." "Where are you going?" Nate asked as I let Licks out of her box and into her pen. "Just somewhere." "Is that a cat?" "Didn't the kids tell you?" I asked. "Yes." "Then why do you ask?" "I'm not sure we have room for a cat," Nate said. "It's not your cat," I said. "It's mine. It's a female. Her name is Licks, but I'm sure the kids already told you that. And don't forget to give her fresh water. I'll be back in about an hour." As I took off on foot for the liquor store, I called Steve and told him Lockie had found what he believed was footage from the day of the robbery. "I'll be over as soon as I can," he told me. When I got to the liquor store, sweating and out of breath, Lockie met me at the front door and unbolted it to let me in. I supposed that he wouldn't be open for hours. At first, I thought we were alone in the place, but then I heard a rattling in the back, and a young man in his early 20s who looked like he could be a relative came out of the back, pushing a hand truck piled high with cases of bottles. "I'm sure I found the right footage," said Lockie. "Unfortunately, it's not terribly good quality." He was right about that. It wasn't good quality, but it was certainly the right footage. It showed a man and a woman enter the scene, doff their masks, and take off again. I could tell from their movements that it wasn't Nate and Harmony. The hair wasn't right either. Nate always kept his hair cut short, and the man in the footage had long, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. Harmony had long, flowing hair, halfway down her back, but this woman looked to have something more akin to a pixie cut. I had yet to meet Ted or Tammy Danson, but they had to be at least in their late 50s, and unless the Dansons were freakishly fit, the two figures in the footage moved like persons blessed with relative youth and couldn't possibly be pushing 60. "That's not my son and his girlfriend for sure," I told Lockie. A few days earlier, this bit of proof that Nate and Harmony had been unjustly arrested would have been a cause for celebration. Now that they were released, the confirmation that someone else had been caught on film taking off and discarding the masks used in the robbery behind Lakey's liquor store didn't constitute much of a revelation. "Have you ever met Ted and Tammy Danson?" I asked Lakey. I'd searched the internet for images of the Dansons once just to see what they looked like, but I hadn't come up with a single picture of Ted, and the headshot of Tammy, which accompanied her real estate listings, might easily be years out of date. "Only Tammy," said Lakey. "She listed a house for me last summer." "Does that look anything like her?" "Could be her, I suppose, but I don't really think so," said Lakey. "She does have short, dark hair. But not that short, if her professional headshot was anything to go by." "I wonder about the male robber," I said. "Well, we know at the time of the robbery he had long hair and at least one big tattoo." "Tattoo?" I missed that. Lockie reversed the footage until he reached the part where Richard Nixon was dropping his disguise. As the man reached up to remove the full head mask, the long sleeve of the light blue shirt he was wearing hiked up. The footage was far too poor a quality to tell what kind of tattoo it was, but either the man was wearing a printed shirt underneath, which would have been an odd choice given he was already wearing long sleeves, or he had a full sleeve tattoo. It had to be Matt, and I strongly suspected that the woman was Lara. The quality of the video was too poor to make a positive identification, but I was convinced in my own mind that it was her. I felt like a fool for believing Lara. She'd played the part of sympathetic niece so well. She'd seemed genuinely broken up about the whole thing. Other than simply wanting the cash out of the safe, I asked Lockie, why would someone hold up a gas station? I mean, if it was an inside job. "What makes you think the robbery at Frank's was an inside job?" said Lockie. I didn't want to say that I was convinced it was Frank's niece Lara and her husband he'd caught on his security cameras. "Let's just say, for example, that what happened to Frank also happened to you, except it was someone close to you who held up your liquor store and shot you in the process. What would be the possible motives for that?" "The obvious motive is that someone wanted to murder Frank and make it look like an armed robbery, but they botched the job," said Lockie. "That was the most obvious motive, but that was exactly what Lara had coached me to believe Tammy Danson had done, and I was all but certain everything Lara had said to me had been a lie." "What else?" I asked Lakey. "What other reason could there be?" "Well," Lockie paused, and it took considerable prodding on my part to get it out of him, but he finally continued. "Business owners have been known to pretend to be robbed so they can collect insurance money." "How would that even work?" I asked. "I'm not for a second suggesting that's what happened at Frank's," said Lakey. "I can't imagine Frank being so desperate for insurance money that he'd shoot himself in the stomach and put himself into a coma to pull off an insurance scam." I conceded that this seemed highly unlikely and not the actions of a sane person. "And wouldn't all he'd be able to collect be a few $100s from the safe?" "It's hard to know," said Lockie. "In cases like robbery or fire, insurance companies pretty much have to take the insured party at their word about what got stolen or damaged unless they have some way of proving otherwise." Chapter 32. "You've been enormously helpful," I said to Lockie as we stood in the back office of his liquor store, staring at the screen of his laptop. "I hope you'll consider turning this footage over to the police department." I never got confirmation from Lockie about his intentions regarding the footage because just as he was opening his mouth to answer, Steve walked in. "Look at this," I said, and Lockie rewound the footage. "It's not Nate and Harmony," said Steve after he'd watched the robbers doff their masks. "It's not Ted and Tammy Danson either," I said. "But I think I do know who it is." "Who?" Steve asked. Maybe I shouldn't have been so trusting of Lockie, but I couldn't help sharing my revelation with Steve. "I think it's Lara and Matt." Laura? Frank's niece, Laura? Yes, I said. I can't believe it, said Steve. I wouldn't have believed it either if the misgiving that Laura wasn't lying to me hadn't been stewing in the back of my mind ever since I'd first met her. Believe it, I said. It's just that... What? Has there been a new development? You could say that, said Steve. I called the hospital to check on visiting hours and discovered that Frank Vatu has been discharged. Discharged? I thought he was supposed to be in a coma. That's what I thought too. And I guess he was up until a few days ago. Let's go, I told Steve. Go where? To see Frank. He's not at home either. I have his address, but when I went to his house, there was no one there. That doesn't surprise me one bit, I said. Do you know where Tiffany lives? Tiffany? Frank's ex-wife. No, but I know she works at that seafood place we went to the other evening with Samantha. Well, I find myself suddenly craving fish, I said. We got to the restaurant before the lunch rush and asked the hostess if we could be seated in Tiffany's section. For a woman whose parents had both just been locked up awaiting trial for the attempted murder of her ex-husband, she seemed awfully blasé. But I decided that I should not prejudge her. She seemed more irritated than anything, but perhaps her impatience was just a mask for worry. Your feet must get awfully tired, I said to her as I put in my order for blackened salmon. Waiting tables is nothing compared to running around after a couple of kids all day. I know what you mean, said Steve. My grandkids are a handful. After a day with them, I'm exhausted. Yeah, well, I lost my babysitter, Tiffany said. I was pretty sure she was referring to her own mother and father, and her main worry seemed to be that she no longer had free and on-demand childcare. Oh, I said. Yeah, fortunately, their dad took them off my hands for a few days until I can figure something out. I would have asked more questions, but another party had just been seated in her section, and Tiffany went to take their order. Frank's taken the kids, I said in a low voice, and I'm guessing Tiffany won't be seeing anything more of them for a long time. Why do you say that? Steve asked. Because Tiffany wouldn't go looking for them, and Tammy and Ted Danson were locked up in the Maui County Correctional Center. That was why. Just a feeling, I said. Wouldn't Frank still be recovering from his injuries? Would he be up to looking after the kids? I imagine that Frank's gunshot wound is all but healed, I said. And I strongly suspect that if he ever was in a coma, he's been faking it for quite some time now. Why? Said Steve. I'll tell you later, I said, glancing over to the next table. The couple beside us didn't seem to be paying any attention to what I was saying, but there was no need to risk being overheard. As soon as we'd left the restaurant, Steve was adamant that I explain my theory that Frank had been faking his coma. I can't be sure he was faking it, I said. But does it make any sense that if a man got shot in the stomach, he'd be comatose for weeks on end? Steve admitted it didn't, but said he couldn't understand why in the world Frank would fake unconsciousness. I think he was buying time, I said. For what? To figure out what to do about the tangled mess he'd created? He? Frank. Frank. Isn't he the biggest victim here? Steve said. I strongly suspected that Nate and Harmony getting picked up at the scene had never been part of the plan. I wasn't convinced that Frank getting hit in the stomach by a bullet had been either. I had a theory forming in my mind, but it all hinged on getting access to information that could probably only be legally obtained with a subpoena or a confession. Getting a confession was definitely the more realistic option. You said Frank's not at home? He doesn't appear to be, Steve said. And according to Tiffany, he has their kids? Seems that way. Then he's hiding somewhere, I told Steve. Possibly, but to what purpose? To buy a little more time before he takes the kids and leaves the island. Why? To start a new life with his ill-gotten gains, most likely. But how much he'd managed to make off the botched scheme was very much in question. Most likely, Frank had amassed medical bills that far outweighed his stash of cash, And when those bills went to collections, he'd lose whatever he had left. "Do you know if Tammy Danson's mother is still in rehab?" I asked. "I don't, but all I have to do is call the rehab place and ask to speak to her to find out. Why do you ask?" "Just a hunch," I said. "Please call and find out." Steve called the rehab facility, and 2 minutes later, we knew that Tammy Danson's mother was still in Wailuku Town. 15 minutes after that, and after considerable effort in convincing Steve that my idea wasn't crazy, we were on our way back up to Hana. I'd called Nate to tell him I wouldn't be returning to Island Ice Cream during business hours, although I offered to come in late and make a couple of batches of ice cream to restock the dipping bays. "Take your time, Mom," was all Nate said. I had a feeling that if he'd known what Steve and I were really up to, he wouldn't have approved. But since I didn't want to burden him with the truth, I dialed Linda soon after. "Steve and I are heading up to Hana," I told her. "I'm going to text you the exact location we're headed for after I hang up. If I haven't called you by 10 tonight to confirm that I'm back safely, I want you to call the police." "What are you up to?" Linda demanded. "I'll explain later." "You'd better. Does this have to do with the holdup at Frank's?" I think my silence on the other end of the line said everything there was to say, because Linda followed up her question with an admonition not to stick my nose in where it didn't belong, and a reminder that I had a son who'd probably like to spend some time with his mother now that he'd been sprung from lockup. "It's something I have to do," I told her. I was sticking my nose in where it didn't belong. I should just sit back and enjoy the fact that Nate and Harmony had been exonerated. That's what I should be doing, but I just couldn't bring myself to allow the grave injustice I was afraid was about to occur. Chapter 33. Our second trip up to Hana seemed to take even longer than the first. "I hope you know what you're doing," Steve said as we crept up the road on the way to Tammy's mother's place. Someone had dumped a load of gravel in the spot where we'd had to abandon Steve's Jeep on our first trip up to the house. So this time around, it looked like we were going to make it the entire way in the car. When we reached the clearing where the house stood, I could see that someone had made repairs to it too. The part of the roof, which had been covered over with a tarp, now had shiny new tin on it. "I hope you know what you're doing," Steve repeated for a second time as he cut the engine a few yards from the house. When I got out, I could hear the sounds of children playing, and the source of the laughter was apparent when 2 little girls under the age of 8 darted around the side of the house before pulling up short when they saw us. "Dad!" the oldest of the 2 shouted. A man came out the front door and stood clinging to the railing of the porch. "Are you Frank?" I asked, although I already knew the answer. He looked exactly like you'd expect a previously healthy man in his late 30s who'd been shot in the stomach and then spent weeks on his back in a hospital bed to look. He didn't look great. Frank didn't acknowledge my introduction. "What do you want?" he said. "I'm Nate Rose's mother," I said, "and this is Harmony's dad." I pointed to Steve, but Frank was looking down at his feet. At first, I thought Frank hadn't heard me, but he finally said wearily, "You'd better come inside." "How in the world did you find me?" Frank asked as Steve and I perched on the edge of an old couch, and Frank took a seat in a straight-back chair a few feet away. "We've been here before," I said. "Matt followed us up here." "You know everything then?" Frank said. I didn't know everything, but I wanted Frank to keep talking, so I just smiled. "You know we're relieved to have Nate and Harmony back at home," I said, "but I can't help wondering if you made the right decision to plant the evidence at the Dansons." "It wasn't my idea," said Frank. "Did you know about it?" Frank shrugged. It wasn't exactly an admission of guilt, but it wasn't a denial either. "Someone had to take the blame," said Frank. "Did you want your kids taking the fall for it?" "The person who actually shot you should be the one to take the blame," Steve said, who'd maintained complete silence up until this point. "You really don't know what happened, do you?" Frank said. If you don't know what happened, then why are you interfering? Because I know it wasn't either of the Dansons who shot you, I said. I think you should know that Matt and Lara have been captured on security footage. That's not possible, said Frank. The only camera that caught them was... There's footage of them in the act of taking their masks off, I said. And no one would mistake them for Ted and Tammy Danson. Frank sagged in his seat. I can't let them get in trouble for what happened, he said. It was my idea. What was your idea? The insurance fraud or shooting yourself? It was a long shot bringing up insurance fraud, but since I hadn't come up with any more likely motive for this twisted scenario, I decided to go with it. I didn't mean to shoot myself, Frank insisted, all but acknowledging that my hunch about insurance fraud had been spot on. I was going to shoot a couple of holes in the wall behind the register, and then Lara was going to take the gun away with her before I called the police. How did you end up with a bullet in your stomach then? Steve asked. I was startled when Tiffany came in, Frank said. Tiffany? Your ex-wife, Tiffany? What was she doing there? I asked Frank. I was behind on child support. I was guessing that Frank had been behind on all his bills, but this didn't seem to be the time to pry into the particulars of his financial problems. I was shocked to find out that Tiffany had been present at the scene of the shooting. So, Tiffany came in to collect her child support check, I said, but how does that figure into you getting shot? I didn't want her to see the gun. Tiffany and I have a contentious relationship, and I didn't want any misunderstanding. It would be very much in character for her to accuse me of threatening her, so I stuffed the gun beneath my shirt, and the safety must have been off. That's how you got shot? Steve asked. You stuffed it under your shirt with the safety off and accidentally shot yourself in the stomach. I was having a hard time processing this. If this were the case, surely Nate and Harmony would have heard some interaction between Tiffany and Frank as they hid behind the soda fountain counter. They'd crept out to render aid after Frank had been shot, and then seen one of the masked robbers return and dart behind the counter once again. In order for Frank's story to be true, Tiffany would have had to get into the store without setting off the bell hanging over the front entrance. How did Tiffany get in? I asked. She came in the back, said Frank without missing a beat. She refuses to give up her key to the place. All right, said Steve. What happened after the gun went off? I have no idea, Frank told us. I passed out. If Frank was telling the truth, then Tiffany had left her ex-husband lying there crumpled on the floor to bleed to death. There was no record of any 911 calls besides the one Nate and Harmony had placed using Frank's own phone. I supposed Lara's neglect to call for emergency assistance could be excused by the fact that when she'd returned to collect the pillowcase full of loot, she'd have seen that someone had been attempting to render first aid to Frank. A bloody towel wouldn't have just appeared and pressed itself into Frank's wound. Did Lara know that there was someone in the filling station when she returned for the pillowcase full of cash? I asked. I think she did, said Frank. After they ditched the masks, Lara circled back around to check on me, and when she got back to the filling station, the ambulance was already there. How long did you stay passed out? Steve asked. For a few hours at least. I woke up in a hospital bed after my condition had stabilized. Lara was there and told me what had happened. When the nurse came in to check on me, I pretended to still be out of it, and the whole thing just kind of snowballed from there. But why do the Dansons have to take the blame? Steve asked. I mean, we're grateful that Nate and Harmony are off the hook for the shooting, but it's just not right. If the Dansons are convicted, they'll be facing 30 years. Or worse. I know it's not right, said Frank, but after Tiffany basically left me for dead like that, Tiffany's not the one sitting in jail right now, I pointed out. Chapter 34. I know Tiffany's not the one sitting in jail right now, said Frank wearily. Like I said, it wasn't my idea to frame the Dansons. The truth is that even though I've never gotten along with Ted and Tammy, they've always been great to my kids. But why does anyone have to be framed for anything? Steve said. Why can't you just tell the truth? I added. It's too late to tell the truth, said Frank. If I do? If you just told the truth from the start, said Steve. Or even half the truth, I said. You could have told the truth about accidentally shooting yourself. It would have been easy to say that you'd pulled out a gun to defend yourself from the masked robbers and instead accidentally shot yourself. You could have vouched for Nate and Harmony. It would have been easy. You could have just said they were present but not involved in the robbery and that they came to your aid after you were shot by unidentified robbers who fled. You're right, said Frank. I could have done that, but it's too late for that now. And this was all to get some little measly insurance payout? I said. I could feel anger over the senselessness of it welling up inside of me. I hope it was worth it. I haven't even gotten that, said Frank wearily. The underwriter was waiting for me to fill out the paperwork when I regained consciousness. Wait, said Steve. You're not already on the hook for insurance fraud? Yet. I guess not, said Frank. So the only crime that's actually been committed is planting that jewelry at the Dansons, Steve pointed out. And the gun, said Frank. But the gun must have been registered to you, said Steve. How did that not raise red flags? It wasn't registered to me, said Frank. Matt loaned it to me. I guess it wasn't registered to anyone. Lara grabbed the gun off me when she came in again to get the pillowcase full of cash and saw that I had shot myself. Possession of an unregistered, possibly stolen firearm could get added to the list. There had to be some other crime in there somewhere, but since Frank hadn't filed a false police report, or any report, as far as I knew, there probably wasn't even that to pin on him. I imagined a major motive for Frank deciding to hide out up here in the beyond was avoiding having to talk to the police. They couldn't ask Frank questions he didn't want to answer if they couldn't even find him. Not that the police probably suspected Frank of any wrongdoing. And planting evidence at the Dansons wasn't something you did yourself? I said. Lara meant well. I supposed Lara did have her uncle's best interests in mind, although framing the Dansons seemed a twisted way of showing it, even if it had gotten Nate and Harmony off the hook. There has to be a way out of this, I said. You can't let the Dansons go to trial for attempted murder. Frank's shoulders were slumped. He wasn't the most morally upright man I'd ever met. But there was quite an ethical gulf between a failed attempt at insurance fraud and letting a couple of innocent bystanders go to jail for attempted murder. Why did Lara hide the jewelry underneath Nate and Harmony's steps? I asked as an afterthought. I don't know if Frank knew, or if he did know if he had any intention of answering honestly, because as I was still asking the question, I heard a vehicle pulling in, and Frank got up and looked out the open door, as if to see who his second unexpected visitor of the day was. It was Lara, and she didn't look happy when she saw Steve and me sitting on the couch. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Steve was the one who answered, "We're here discussing what to do about the Dansons." "What do you mean?" Lara demanded. "They're as guilty as sin." "Are they?" I said. "It doesn't look that way." Lara was temporarily baffled. "Someone caught you and Matt on their security camera," said Frank. "They know." Lara looked at us in disbelief as Frank pointed to Steve and me. "I should have thought you'd be grateful," she spat out. "I got your kids out of jail, didn't I? Don't tell me your snooping is what led to this." Frank might have been pointing at both of us, but now Lara was pointing too, and she was only pointing at me. "I can't unknow what I know," I said. "You shouldn't have planted that jewelry at the Dansons." "Who said it was me?" said Lara. "For that matter, who says it was planted?" "I do," I said. "If you didn't do it, who did?" "What's it to you if I did?" said Laura. "You're really okay with letting the Dansons get 30 years for attempted murder?" I asked. "Yeah, I am," Laura insisted. "And now that I see how you really are, I should have just left your kids in jail to rot." "I don't believe you," I said. "You're not really that kind of person." It was pretty clear that Laura was the kind of person who'd plant evidence, and the hair was starting to stand up on the back of my neck. I definitely wasn't regretting that I'd told Linda our location in case she needed to tell the police where the bodies were buried, and I hoped that wouldn't turn out to be just a figure of speech. It was still hours until 10, however, and by the time Linda sent out a search party for Steve and me, anything could have happened. "Enough," Frank said. I think he was talking to Laura, but he was looking up at the ceiling with his fists clenched at his sides. "Do the police already have the footage that shows Matt and Laura?" he asked. I didn't know what to say. I didn't actually know one way or the other. Lockie had expressed intentions of turning the footage over to law enforcement, but I had no way of knowing whether he'd actually done it yet. I hesitated so long that Laura lost patience with me and came to stand directly in front of me. "You know," she said, "I actually felt sorry for you. What a waste." "I don't know if the person who is in possession of the footage has turned it over to the police," I said. "Who is it?" Laura demanded. "Who has the footage?" I pressed my lips together. If Laura thought about it very long, she'd probably arrive at the answer herself. I regretted telling Frank that we had proof that Laura and Matt had been the ones who'd held up his store, but that had been my ticket to get him to talk. "Enough," Frank said once more, and this time he walked over to Laura and made her sit down in a chair beside him. "We're all in a mess," he said, "and I was the one who started it. Steve and Cynthia here are right, though. We shouldn't let Ted and Tammy Danson get charged with attempted murder." Laura sat in the straight-back chair and sulked like a teenager. I was inclined to believe Frank's assertion that he hadn't been consulted about planting the jewelry at the Dansons, but if Frank hadn't persisted in pretending to be unconscious, none of this would have happened at all. "Why did you hide the jewelry under Nate and Harmony's steps?" I asked. It was a little off the subject, but I was still confused about a lot of things, and there'd never be a better opportunity to demand answers. "I didn't want to get caught with it," said Laura. "And who was the person least likely to report finding it to the police?" She had me there. "Did you want me to find it?" I asked. "Of course," said Laura. "I wanted you to believe the Dansons were guilty and trying to frame Nate and Harmony." That had rather backfired on her, but it seemed counterproductive to point that out now. "Is that why Matt followed us up here the first time we came? Is that why he let us see him?" Laura looked genuinely confused. "You've been up here before? Matt was here?" I couldn't decide if Laura was lying to me. She'd fooled me before. I ignored her question and countered with one of my own. "Did you or Matt break into Island Ice Cream the same day Steve and I came up here looking for evidence?" I demanded. Chapter 35. "What? Island Ice Cream got broken into?" Laura was all innocence, but I wasn't buying it. If she and Matt had stashed the jewelry under Nate and Harmony's front steps, it only stood to reason they'd also have hidden the gun somewhere on their property as well. I suppose that after Matt had left me alone at the Jeep the day he'd followed Steve and me up to Hana, Matt had hurried back down to Wailuku town ahead of us and recovered the gun from where he'd hidden it inside the trailer. I couldn't prove it, of course, but it made sense. He'd needed the gun back so he could plant it at the Dansons. "We're out $557.37, I said, "plus the cash box and the repair fees to fix the door." "I really don't know anything about the break-in," Laura said, "but then I don't know where Matt hid the gun, so possibly it was him." "You two don't seem to communicate very well," I said. I'd meant it sarcastically, but it seemed that I had hit a nerve. Laura's face abruptly crumpled and her eyes welled up in tears. "He lies all the time," she said. It seemed to me that made them two peas in a pod, but I kept my snarky remark to myself. "He's having an affair," she said. "I found out yesterday." "With Tammy Danson," I said. Perhaps I had been too hasty in dismissing Martin's assumption that Matt was at the Dansons all the time because he was up to no good with Tammy. "No, not with Tammy," Lara said. "Who is it?" Frank demanded, rising unsteadily from his chair. "Don't tell me they're at it again?" Lara kept looking at the floor and nodded. "I never should have listened to him," Frank said. "I should have never trusted him." I wondered if he was referring to Matt, and Lara's next statement confirmed it. "I believed him when he said he was sorry," she said. "I really did, and I didn't think Tiffany would take him back anyway." "Tiffany?" I couldn't help interrupting. "Matt is having an affair with Tiffany?" "What's it to you?" Lara shot back, as if suddenly realizing Steve and I were still in the room. Lara was right. It probably wasn't relevant. Steve finally brought us back around to the matter at hand. "We'll try to delay the police getting hold of those surveillance tapes for a couple of days," he said. That was a big if. Lockie might have already turned the footage over to the police, not that law enforcement was likely to immediately identify the culprits other than to determine that it wasn't the Dansons who'd been caught on camera, and they'd yet again locked up a pair of innocent parties. "We don't know what the status is on the footage," I admitted. "But if you can figure out a way to spring the Dansons, we'll try to buy you another couple of days before the footage gets turned over to the police." "We'll be going then," said Steve. "Thanks so much for your time." I half expected him to extend his hand to Frank as if he was a salesman who'd just closed a deal. "Yes, it's been a very enlightening visit," I said. Neither Frank nor Lara said anything. They just stood there and watched us go. I think they were too shocked to do anything else. It wasn't until we were on the other side of Hana, heading back down to Wailuku town, that I finally breathed easier. As soon as I had gotten cell coverage, I'd texted Lockie and asked him if he'd been in contact with law enforcement. When he'd told me he hadn't gotten around to it yet, I'd asked him to wait a few days until I'd got back to him on what to do with the footage, and he'd agreed. "I can't believe Frank and Lara confessed to everything," I said. "You think they told us the whole truth?" said Steve. "Most of it, anyway." "But what do we do with the truth?" Steve said. "Other than get Lockie to turn the footage over to the police and implicate Matt and Lara in the robbery, there's not much we can do with what we learned." "It's not like Matt and Lara wouldn't deserve that outcome," I said. Steve didn't answer, but it was clear he didn't entirely agree with me. "They deserve to have something happen to them," I conceded, "but even I can see they don't deserve to get charged with attempted murder. Not if Frank is telling the truth about accidentally shooting himself." "I don't think Frank would let that happen," said Steve. "I don't think he'd let his niece go to prison for attempted murder. He might let Matt go, though." "Possibly," Steve said, "but the prime evidence against Matt implicates Lara, too." "True." It was a conundrum. All we could do was wait out the next couple of days, and if there were no future developments, then we'd give Lockie the go-ahead to turn his incriminating footage over to the police. 2 days passed before I heard anything more about the case. I was at Island Ice Cream, hefting a bag of mix-up onto my shoulder, when my phone rang. It was Steve. "I heard from Frank Vatu," he said. "Frank went down to the police station this morning and confessed to shooting himself." "How did he explain that?" "I think he told the truth about how he got shot," said Steve. "But only parts of it, of course. I'm sure he left out the bit about having the gun in the first place because he was contemplating insurance fraud. How did Frank explain the evidence planted at the Dansons?" Chapter 36. Frank explained away his family heirloom jewelry being found at the Dansons by telling them that the police report had been made in error, Steve said. He said that he'd been unconscious at the time when Lara had informed the police that the jewelry in question had been stolen out of the safe. Frank told the police that Lara had reported the jewelry stolen in good faith because he'd removed it from the safe a day or two before the robbery without telling her he was giving it to Tammy Danson. Oh, yes. Frank told them that since it was family jewelry meant for his daughters, he'd gone ahead and turned it over to his mother-in-law for safekeeping. Creative. I thought so. And the police bought his story. What about the gun they recovered at the Dansons? Frank told them it was Matt's. Why would Matt be keeping a gun at the Dansons? He wasn't. Frank told the police that Ted Danson took it away from Matt and threatened him with it because Matt was a married man having an affair with his daughter. That was believable and sort of half true. Is there any danger that Matt might press charges if Ted admits to threatening him? I doubt Ted would ever admit to it since it never happened, and if Matt wants to press charges, he'd have to admit to being in possession of a stolen gun. Isn't having a stolen firearm a serious offense? The police would have to determine who the gun belonged to in order to charge anyone with possession. I imagine the Wailuku PD will just impound the gun, stick it in a locker, and be happy to be done with the whole debacle. When are Ted and Tammy Danson getting released? I asked. They just were, said Steve. And just in time. Just in time for what? I have a surprise. For the Dansons? I asked. No, for you, but Tammy Danson has something to do with it. Oh? I'll text you an address. Meet me there this evening at 7. What is this all about? If I told you, it wouldn't be a surprise. I was about to hang up when I thought of one more loose end that still puzzled me. Why was the jewelry box singed? I asked. I was curious about that, too. You asked? I did. Frank says that right after they staged the robbery and Frank got shot, Matt kind of panicked and tried to burn all the evidence. Lara caught him and pulled the jewelry out of the fire because she knew it was important to Frank. That was believable. What about the defaced bills? I didn't ask. I decided it didn't matter. In all probability, the bills altered to look like Charlie Chaplin had been defaced by Lara herself in an attempt to lend credence to her suspicions that the Dansons were the ones who'd held up Frank's filling station. I can't help feeling a little let down by this outcome, I told Steve. How so? Frank has certainly paid for his mistakes, I said, but I can't help feeling like Lara and Matt practically got away with murder. There was no murder, Steve pointed out. Not even an attempted one despite obvious appearances. It could have turned out much, much worse, he added. True. Nate and Harmony could still be sitting in their cells at the Maui County Correctional Center awaiting trial for armed robbery and attempted murder. That would definitely have been worse. Still, Steve must have heard me sighing on the other end of the line because he said, I promise the surprise I have for you will cheer you up. It better be good, I said. Oh, it is, said Steve and hung up on me. At 7 that evening, I stood outside the address Steve had texted me. It was a duplex about 6 blocks from Nate and Harmony's. Steve's Jeep was in the driveway and the door to Unit A was hanging open, so I walked up and knocked on it to announce my presence. You're here, Steve said as he emerged from one of the 2 empty bedrooms with a broad smile on his face. What do you think? Steve said, motioning around the barren living room. It's nice. Are you renting it? No, I bought it. I signed the papers this afternoon and Tammy just came by to drop off the keys and take away the for sale sign. Congratulations, I said. I know you weren't happy with your landlord, so I'm sure it'll be nice to have your own place. You don't quite get it, do you? Steve said. He was smiling more broadly than ever. What don't I get? I bought the whole thing, said Steve. I thought. Steve paused, and I suddenly got it. He was offering to let me move into the other side, Or at least that's what I hoped he was offering. Would it be weird living next door to Steve? Possibly, but if the other unit was anything like the one I was standing in, I'd have a hard time finding anything better. Are you offering to rent the other side to me? I asked. I am, said Steve. I'd been looking for something to buy for a while, and when this came available, I made an offer on it. I thought it was the perfect solution to all of our problems. Our problems? Since when did my problems become his problems, too? I'm very grateful, I said, but I don't even know what a place like this rents for. How much do you have to spend a month on rent? Steve asked. That all depended. Would I find a job? Nate and Harmony could use my part-time help at Island Ice Cream, but I was sure they couldn't afford to pay me a full-time salary. I don't know, I said. Until I find a job, I was planning on trying to find something for under $600 a month, and this clearly rents for a lot more than that. I've been looking. $600 a month would get me a bedroom with a shared bath in someone's rundown house. It wouldn't get me a newish, clean two-bedroom unit. Steve's face had fallen. He clearly knew what the duplex was worth and hoped I didn't. It was sweet of him, but it was weird enough to become Steve's tenant, much less his tenant at half the market rate. I thought you might enjoy having a roommate, said Steve. Enjoy was probably setting the bar a bit high. Tolerate would probably be more like it. Did you have someone in mind? I asked. My sister, said Steve. Oh? Harmony's aunt, he added, as if I'd have trouble working that one out for myself. He was transparently nervous now that he had moved on to Plan B, but determined to make this solution to my lodging problem work. Is your sister moving? I asked. This was the first I'd heard of Steve having a sister. April's been talking about coming back from the mainland for over a year now. And she's open to living with a stranger? I protested. You're not a stranger. I am to her. You're not, Steve insisted. I've told her all about you. I couldn't help wondering what Steve had said about me. Do the kids know about this? I asked. No, said Steve. I thought we'd surprise them. It would be a surprise, all right. I was sure Nate and Harmony wanted Steve and me to get along, but this next door to each other scenario was likely to lead to complications. I suddenly found the idea of complications strangely appealing. I'll do it, I said. I'll move in tomorrow. Great, said Steve. We can have a double housewarming and surprise the kids. I have one condition, I said, and pointed to the cardboard carrier that contained licks. The cardboard box was currently encased in a reusable grocery bag as extra camouflage. I'd very nearly been caught that morning bringing her downstairs when she'd decided to start mewing loudly as I exited the elevator. Licks? Steve said. I'm tired of sneaking her in and out of my hotel room. I'm looking for a place that allows cats. I would have thought that was a given, said Steve. Now let me drive you back to your hotel for one last night, and tomorrow we'll cobble together some furniture so you can move in. Night had fallen as we drove through the quiet back streets of Wailuku town to my budget hotel a few blocks from the beach. The moon had risen, and a warm breeze wafted in through the open top of Steve's Jeep. I was suddenly flooded with a sense of well-being that had been missing for a long time. Had the matter of Frank Vatu's shooting resolved entirely to my satisfaction? No, it had not. But that was life. You know, said Steve as he pulled up at the front entrance of my hotel, Matt and Laura will eventually get what's coming to them. When you treat people badly, it'll come back to bite you sooner or later. I'm sure you're right, I said. Good people eventually get repaid too, you know. I suppose. I think you are a good person. I didn't know what to say to that. Steve was looking at me the way no man had looked at me for a long, long time. Thank you, I said, and leaped out of the car before things got any weirder. I could hear Steve laughing at me all the way into the open-air lobby, but I didn't dislike the sound. I liked Steve. I really did. but I wasn't in a hurry to find out exactly how much I liked him anytime soon. "We're going home tomorrow," I told Lix as I let her out of her makeshift carrier and into the over-air-conditioned hotel room that smelled vaguely of mildew, pine cleaner, and stale cigarettes. "You're going to like it," I added. I was pretty sure I was. I was just crawling into bed when I got a text from Nate. The weirdest thing happened this morning. "What?" "Ed found our cash box." "Wow." "In the front seat of his truck." "Weird." "He left it unlocked overnight." "Was the cash box empty?" "Number." "How much?" $557.37. "No note?" "Just a sticky note that said Island Ice Cream on it." "That's it?" "There was another sticky note inside. It said sorry." A terse apology on a sticky was hardly sufficient for what Nate and Harmony had been through, but it was something anyway. Did the door repair guy come? Nate sent back a thumbs up. "How much was it?" "No charge." "He wouldn't take any money." Said it was the least he could do. "Why?" "No idea. I had a pretty good idea Frank had something to do with it, but I didn't say so. Nate didn't need to know everything that had gone on behind the scenes. He had enough on his mind as it was." "Good night, Nate." "Good night, Mom. As long as I'm living, my baby, you'll be." I could almost hear Nate's 4-year-old voice in the room when my phone dinged one final time. It was as if we were both seeing the same dog-eared page of the picture book we'd read together 1,000 times. "As long as I'm living, my mommy, you'll be."
This is the end of Mangoes and Malice. Check Celia's channel for many more complete, cozy mystery audiobooks, or visit anywhere ebooks are sold for digital and paper copies of Celia's novels and short stories.